impacts of these boundary adjustments might be, and they appear to be quite limited. The yellow is general habitat management area identified in modeling from the USGS that we use for planning purposes, as well as the BLM and other federal agencies. The red, or the orange, excuse me, the yellow is other habitat management area. The orange is general, and then the red is priority. So there's no or very little priority that seems to be encompassed in here, but there's small portions of general habitat. In terms of on-the-ground activities, the Stillwater Range is the primary area of yellow that you see going across the central portion of that. And we do not really have a thriving population of sage grouse in that area at this time. The models appear to somewhat overvalue that area. On the other hand, the Clan Alpines that are off to the east, there is a good population there, and it is a key area for management for the species. Access-specific concerns, again, I'm using the red arrows here to point out where road closures would occur on the boundaries. Probably the most notable one is for the entire proposal is the road that is on the west side of the gray area. The gray represents what's currently closed for the bombing activities that occur in Fairview Valley. The blue, again, the darker blue, almost purple, is proposed new areas for closure. You can see at that arrow on the left side of the map that is the highway that goes down the valley along the east face of the Sand Springs Range. About 4 miles off of Highway 50, that road will be closed. For those of you familiar with the area, you'll note that that's going to halt access to the better parts for hunting both chukar and bighorn sheep. That's more or less in the southern portion of that range. So we're definitely concerned about that and what it means, not just for hunter access, but also for management activities for those populations. There's additional roads on the other side of the map that would limit access to Bell Flat, and then some north entry into the Monte Cristo Mountains. As we move south, you'll see that actually the Monte Cristo Mountains are entirely enclosed within the closure area, so there would be no access to that mountain range as it's currently recommended anyway. Those pink areas are private inholdings that they plan to acquire. And then on the west side of this map, again, other areas where roads would be closed that would formerly have provided access across some of those valleys or into Bell Flat or the Monte Cristo Mountains. If we go into one of the north planning areas where they do some activities, some bombing activities south of the interstate, this is currently checkerboard. The land status map from BLM doesn't show it, but the checkerboards within the black in the middle there are currently DOD controlled, so those are not private. But all the pink ones are private pieces that within the new expanded boundary they would seek to acquire. Of importance in the southwest of this map, that cross-hatching, those are National Wildlife Refuge sections that would be also closed and have management withdrawn from the wildlife refuge. You can see on the east side here the two red arrows. That's where the road that goes east of the refuge and through the refuge, and then up north along the Stillwaters appears to be closed off. So again, we're not sure how they'll address that, but they've told us that they would keep that road open. On the north side, below the West Humboldt Range, there would be closure for access to that area as well. An area that's not as much of a concern in terms of wildlife opportunities, this portion of the dead camels is outside of where there's been some older chukar water developments. Those are all in what would be the southern part of this map. Again, I apologize, the dots are too small to really show up, but there's quite a few water developments, many of which were done decades ago. But what concerns us maybe more about this portion of the dead camels that they would close is it's really popular for the OHV community. And we know that if they close an area for OHV, then they're going to probably disperse them to other places that may not currently be impacted by their activities. And that's something that does concern us, what those diffuse impacts from relocating those users would be. The airspace is a little bit confusing in terms of the information they've provided. We've requested their shape files on Airspace, but we haven't received those yet. Basically, again, I apologize, and if you look at the print copy, hopefully you can read this, but the labels here are trying to indicate what the flight floor, how low they can do their flight activities. Currently, their flight floor is somewhat limited across their entire airspace. I believe it's 1,800 feet, Jim, but I'm not sure on that. But it's 1,800 or something higher than that. Many of these areas would have a ground floor, which gives them the opportunity to fly as low as they want, and then huge portions of it are about a 200-foot floor. All the green dots on the map here are active and pending sage-grouse leks. And so getting back to Commissioner Young's question about noise-related impacts, that's something that we would definitely be concerned about and we'll be commenting on, is how we can be assured that breeding activities of sage-grouse won't be disrupted by maybe low-level flights during training. In that case, I would expect that a single flight over a lek would probably break up that lek and would certainly have some disruptive effects on sage-grouse. So we'll be discussing that as we go further along in the planning process with Fallon on this. So in summary, there's 65 water developments that are within the boundaries. Obviously, we're concerned about associated losses of hunter opportunities and habitats for wildlife populations. The Sand Springs bighorn sheep herd is somewhat unique across bighorn sheep, the entirety of their range in North America, and that they've shown an ability to rebound from disease that we haven't seen any responses from other herds quite as dramatic and positive as they had. And so there's some research interest in whether or not there might be some unique factors in that population that provide some disease resistance to some of the pneumonia strains and other domestic interaction disease issues that have affected bighorn sheep across Nevada and across the range of the species. So there is a bigger issue value beyond just hunting opportunities there. We've also utilized that herd as a seed population for reestablishing or augmenting other herds across the state, and it's unclear what effect the closures would have on our ability to do that. Just in terms of the hunt opportunities, there's 41 ram tags in 3 bighorn units, portions of which would be within this closure. In terms of representation of hunt opportunities, that's about 13% of the desert bighorn sheep in the state and 19% of the non-resident tags for desert bighorn sheep. And in terms of raw numbers of hunting opportunities that have occurred since 2001, the numbers that are available there show how much hunting activities occurred within the units that would be affected by the land closures themselves, not the airspace issues. Of course, there's also loss of wildlife viewing opportunities. It's not just the game opportunities that would be affected. Certainly, Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge is a very popular destination for both game and non-game uses, and there's a lot of unknowns still about what effects their training activities and some of their closures would have on the refuge. Wild horse management is another issue that we're concerned about. We've seen at Hawthorne where effectively they've allowed the population of horse and burros to go unchecked there, and it's turned into a real problem in terms of numbers and providing a source population for nearby areas. We're not sure if Fallon would be able to do anything more than the BLM, but we're going to bring this issue up and ask about that. Again, I mentioned the displacement of OHVs already and the airspace effects, but I didn't talk about what those airspace changes might mean in terms of our operations for survey efforts, captures, and then our water development maintenance activities. So there's, with the big change from higher elevation flight activities to a 200-foot or so floor across a lot of Nevada, it may require a little more coordination on our part to be able to do just the day-to-day stuff that our agency has to do to manage wildlife. We did produce a few recommendations that will be included in our scoping comments. Some of those include considering relocating where they want to place their bombing site. I didn't show it on the map, but in the existing bombing area in Fairview Valley, they want to relocate the bombing site further south and west, which would put it closer to the Sand Springs range and those areas of access that are going to be closed. That's the main reason why they would close that access. So we're going to request that they consider alternative siting or utilizing the existing bombing site and coming up with ways to try and adjust their training needs, if possible, to accommodate the existing site. We think that would be one factor that could change where that radius of closure is. They also are desiring to do their bombing releases at a much farther distance than they currently are capable of doing in terms of both height and horizontal distance from target. And so I think if they analyzed something that gets them a lot more in terms of their training capabilities than they currently have today, but not as much as they put out in this first draft, that we'd like to see how that affects these areas that are proposed for closure. That could make a huge impact and alleviate a lot of our concerns. We also need to find out more about what they mean in terms of closures, including roads, but also areas that they say are going to be publicly open but within their boundary. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a management change at the Naval Air Station could change those from open to the public to closed. There would be no need for additional analysis to do something like that. It's literally at the control of the Navy at that point. So we'd like to see that those areas that are open have some guarantees to remain open. And again, if they could look at the effects or the possible effects of the OHV displacement and perhaps consider a dedicated site for OHV users so we don't see dispersed activities across the region. And yes, that's the Sand Springs range and my dog, but she's not bringing me back a chucker because I had a bad day that day.
Questions from the Commission? Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, John, on the map, you had showed the map had shown that it referred to as privately owned lands in the checkerboard, and if I'm understanding you, that's not private lands like individual people or ranches. That could be. That's just pretty much anything that's currently not under the withdrawal or under the ownership of the Fallon Naval Air Station. So there's actually federal lands that they're considering as privately owned in that checkerboard?
Yeah, so those are currently privately owned parcels in the checkerboard. There's a few that are areas that are not in the checkerboard as well that are actively managed for ranching operations that they would also target. But the checkerboard is private land that they would acquire and then move to DOD. So from privately owned to federally owned, which is a different issue in the state that I think other groups will probably speak up about that comment on this.
So those lands aren't necessarily owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service, they're just privately owned lands that are part of the refuge. And
That's correct. Those are, and I don't believe it's called Vidler anymore, but those are former Vidler properties.
Further questions? Commissioner Valentine.
Just for clarification, John, are both these transfers occurring at the same time? And if so, why haven't we been involved with the Navy prior to recently?
Yeah, so they're on similar timelines. Jim?
They're both part of Public Law 10665, which was the 1990, or the 2000 National Defense Authorization Act. So both the Fallon and the NTTR withdrawals expire at the same time, and they're part of the same legislative package that'll go to Congress.
Yeah, so John Tull, they'll be on separate process timelines because they're handled individually by the Air Force in the case of Nellis and the Navy for Fallon. But yeah, as Jim said, they'll end up on the same Defense Authorization Act package in presumably 2021.
They'll be submitted in 2020 for the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act.
And then your second question about why we weren't engaged, I'm not quite sure. We had been hearing a little bit about it. We had probed a little bit. Our regional habitat supervisor had some contact with them, but honestly, I'm not sure why they kind of decided to bring forward a proposal and do it this way, but it's just where it is. But it's early still. This is scoping. We'll be sending in a letter of request to become a cooperator, and we hope then to have a better seat at the table on these discussions. It might be worth mentioning too that I have recently been involved with some meetings with some of the other departments in the state, and there are other agencies with different issues that are also concerned about this, and there is some coordination occurring through the governor's office to get some overarching comments in addition to individual agency comments that go forward on the scoping.
Further questions? Commissioner Hubbs?
I may have missed it in the first presentation, but I realized when you were presenting on Fallon, you were able to actually come up with the number of tags per species in the area, but I didn't see that for the Nevada Test and Training Range.
Yeah, and I apologize. I did not put those numbers together, and I'm not going to flub it. I'll call Brian to come up, and he's not listening. He's got his hearing aid off. No, I don't think he's going to have the numbers either. I apologize. That's something that we can get.
Brian, he was talking about you. Were your ears burning?
Let's not open this can of worms. So I apologize to the commission for not having those numbers. We'll get those and get them to the chairman to distribute in the next week or so, if that's sufficient for you.
Vice Chairman Johnson.
So I guess if I understand correctly, then NDOW is a cooperating agency with the Air Force and has the seat at the table. But with respect to the Navy, that relationship does not exist yet.
Does not currently exist, but I'm confident it will. We did have a good meeting with Fallon. I don't want to paint too bleak of a picture on things. We had a meeting a couple weeks ago and had a good discussion, and we're eager to see them open this analysis up to alternatives, because currently it's just this is what we want, and to be a proper analysis from our perspective, we need to see some alternatives, and so we're going to hopefully come up with some alternatives that they can also analyze and see some improvements in terms of our concerns from there.
Commissioner Young.
One question is, I'm assuming that relationship with the Navy is because of the relatively newness of Fallon Naval Air Station versus the Air Force's relationship in Nevada. I was raised originally from Fallon area, and it seems like there wasn't a whole lot of that activity when I was really young, and then was at Miramar, I believe, and Air Force, or a Navy base or a naval station in California, and then they shifted it to Nevada. Is that correct? It just takes a long time in government sometimes to form those relationships.
I can only really speculate. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's a very large national wildlife refuge down south, and so I think the Air Force recognized the need to engage not just us, but other interest groups and agencies early on. I think Fallon maybe didn't have that overarching issue.
Just one last comment. I didn't even know that this relationship existed. I'm a native here, and thankful that you guys at least cooperate with us. First time I've had my opportunity here in the Wildlife Commission to have the military come in and talk. And we just assumed as a hunter, at least I always did growing up, it's just a fact of life. Nevada's the 7th largest state. We got a lot of wide open spaces. That was our contribution to the defense effort, and I appreciate the fact that you guys do at least think about us a little bit. And my only comment to the rest of the hunting population is, thank God you guys are around to service in our military, and I have no problem with what you have to do to keep this nation safe. And, like I said, I had that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fly in an F-16 for a couple hours, and, flying around a helicopter or fixed wing at 100 knots, 120 knots versus 100, 600 or 700 knots. And this is just when the FA-22 was coming into vogue. I can only imagine how much smaller that area seems, because in PR flight I had a chance to go on, and we practiced hitting these targets, and they let me operate mock weapon systems and whatnot. It's very small up there when you are flying around there at those speeds, and you'd think they definitely need the space. And then, like I said, with the advancement of the speeds and the altitudes and the sophistication of the equipment now, that was 10 years ago. I can only imagine why you need to expand this. So I'm all for it. Appreciate your time.
We appreciate that greatly. It's pretty obvious. We're residents of Nevada too, all our guys, and it's amazing how many of the military are hunters themselves. So we're concerned about it from that aspect, and we want to do this smartly.
Anything further from the commission? Commissioner Valentine.
John, I really hate to put you on the spot on this one, but I got to ask the question. What do you think, in your opinion, in working with the Department of Defense on this transfer, of the possibility of getting a guarantee of access for either the Nellis testing range or the Fallon testing range?
If you want.
Yeah, I think it would be better for the military to.
Well, the interesting thing about this is this is not a military proposal. This is law, and Congress can write anything they want into law. So as part of this and as a part of your jobs, you can lobby Congress. It says we support the military, but we think this should be in the law and it is a law that sets us up, and we are bound by law. So anything can happen. Honestly, anything can happen. I can leave it at that.
I think Paul just wants to see what's going on in Area 51 and see the Martians and all that stuff, so he wants that access.
Commissioner Hubbs.
Just back to the Fallon Naval Air Station, you mentioned Stillwater Range and Refuge, and I just wanted to know how much of the refuge itself is in that slotted area that they're looking at.
So in terms of the area that would be withdrawn, it was either 4 or 5 sections, which is approximately 3,000 acres, roughly. And that particular part of the refuge is not in some of the primarily aquatic habitat, wetland habitat managed areas, but it's a concern that it would, be an area that's currently managed for wildlife that would transition to something else. And I'm sorry, was there a second part to that question, or did that? Okay, thanks.
Anything further from the commission? Hearing none, I guess we'll close section A of that. And thank you again, Jim, for your time, and John as well. And we'll move to section B, Fallon Naval Air Station, Nellis Air Force Base, public land withdrawals. Chairman Wallace, for possible action, the commission will discuss the land withdrawal proposals and may take action to develop a letter with the department's assistance stating the commission's position. I guess we'll start that off with anybody on the commission have any specific things we want to start with on this, or is there a need for a letter? I guess I think there is, but we'll start with Vice Chairman Johnston.
I think the first thing is that any action should be that NDOW does what it can do to become a cooperating agency with the Navy with respect to the Fallon, and so they have the seat at the table in the way they do now with the Air Force with respect to Nellis. I mean, that's, to me, the initial step I'd like to see. The second thing I'd really like to see is, and this may already be required as they go forward, some analysis with the proposals as how they would impact wildlife and wildlife habitat. When you start hearing about Stillwater National Wild Refuge, pieces of it going into Department of Defense ownership or Navy owner, I don't know what it is, and you start thinking, well, how would that additional activity or ownership then impact that waterfowl area that's out in Stillwater? And I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of questions here. And then I think the third issue is not only the impact on wildlife and wildlife habitat, but the impacts on public access, not just for hunting, but for wildlife viewing and other recreational activities. I mean, that seems to me NDOW needs to be a cooperating agency on both projects. We need to look at the access issue, and secondly, the habitat and impact on wildlife additionally, especially when we start talking about can we do continued water development projects, maintenance of existing guzzlers that exist in some of these areas. How's this going to play out? And I think those are very, very important questions and issues to address as this process goes forward.
Commissioner Young?
I guess, I think Commissioner Johnson pretty much hit what I would have recommended, is that cooperative piece with the Navy, of course, and then, any sensitivities that we can possibly address whatsoever that they could impact, and particularly sage grouse. I guess we could identify that one of a critical nature in the entire western United States, and how important it is for them to minimize any impact on the bird and its future. And I think this is where some of the conservationist groups and the others out here in the audience that aren't pro-hunting per se should be also using their influence and their voice to ensure that we're all in this together, and we're all striving to keep our habitat the very best that we can in this state for a variety of reasons. Whether you're a hunter or non-hunter, we all want to see wildlife flourish, and as we all know, our habitat is getting smaller by the minute with the influx of people and other things, I believe, to the state of Nevada. So I think Mr. Johnson pretty much hit the nail on the head.
Vice Chairman Johnston?
Yeah, I guess one additional thing that I'd like to see as the letter's developed is, I get the sense that a lot of people who don't spend time in Nevada think of it as just the desert wasteland. And so it's important, I think, to educate people who are evaluating these proposals that these are wildlife habitat areas. Here are not only the game species, but the non-game species that live in these areas, and that when you talk about these proposals, you could have impacts on that wildlife. And so I think it would be very, very good to, as part of the letter, set it out with an introduction with educating as to the wildlife that exists, the importance of the habitat that's potentially to be impacted, and then go into the additional issues of NDOW's cooperating agency access, impact on habitat restoration, development, and wildlife as well.
Commissioner Hubbs?
And maybe more of that information will come with the development of any future EIS that comes out, but at the same time, I'm thinking, there was a few, when we were talking about the total numbers of tags, it starts to kind of give us, you can extrapolate out how big those population sizes might be in those areas. But we didn't really talk about sensitive species as well, and I think that's really key to understand what sensitive species are in those areas and boundaries and kind of get ahead of the game, knowing that internally ourselves. So when we start to see those developments over time, we know very well what's at stake and how to start to ask for potentially mitigating, alternatives that might help our wildlife.
Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Hubbs hit on an area that I had marked down. John had mentioned the dispersal activities to other areas could cause problems. I know that these are just subsets of some of the bigger items that Commissioner Johnson had kind of laid out, but that was the one that resonated with me is we have a wildlife action plan. We have an idea of our species of concern, our higher priorities, where some of those things are. It's just a huge undertaking. It's a big project to, everywhere from a letter to become a cooperator to actually putting the actual issue on the table to discuss it. It's a daunting project. I don't envy you guys for having to go through it. I appreciate that you're headed there and that it'll occur, but certainly I think our wildlife action plan plays a real important role in it at this time because it does address those more sensitive areas that can be highlighted as part of any conversation. So we've got some stuff on the table already. A lot of hard work's already been put into it, and to tie that in and cross it over. I definitely have more concerns with the Fallon stuff than I did with the Air Force stuff. Air Force, I had a lot less reservations about hearing the conversation. A lot less flags went up the pole. Maybe that's because of the lack of alternatives that have, maybe are on the table. Hopefully that'll come. But definitely with the Fallon stuff, it just seems to be it's a really big project. I've been out in enough of those areas to know how extensive it is, and it just doesn't seem to have the same feel to it of cooperation. So the cooperator thing is a big deal for me as well.
Hubbs?
I was just wondering, I don't quite know, who we want to address all of these letters to, but I don't know if we should address anything to our legislature as well, just letting them know too, if we do have concerns, what they might be.
I think we kind of have that option to set that up the way this is worded for the agenda, so it could go many different directions. We just need to have that discussion, and I think at this point, if there's no further commission discussion, I think we need to go out to public comment and get some more information and then bring it back to us, and we can decide which direction we want to start going towards. So following that, is there any further commission discussion? Okay, this is an action item. We'll take it out for public comment in Las Vegas first.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have comments in Las Vegas.
Yes, Clint Bentley for the record. And I would like to state that the fraternity of the Desert Bighorn is opposed to all of the alternatives on the Nellis withdrawal. And I'd like to also remind you that in 1999, the wildlife community and the general community were all assured that the Air Force did not need and would not need any additional areas to what they had at that time. In the end, if with the event that there is a withdrawal, we need to be very careful and make sure that there's definitive language regarding maintenance access, wildlife management, and general access, because we've learned in the past that on any kind of withdrawals, whether they're wilderness or military, without definitive language, we lose everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Clint. Any further?
No further comment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Public comment in Carson City. Paul?
For the record, Paul Dixon speaking on behalf of myself. I've spent, since this started getting published, at least for the Nellis stuff down south, talking with our county commissioners as well as some of our congressional representatives. And I can tell you to the T, 100% of them are behind moving forward with this. And so, as was mentioned to us earlier by the gentleman representing the Department of Defense, I believe you asked a question, Commissioner Hubbs, who should we send the letters to? We need to lobby our congressional people with the concerns raised by Clint, and you'll hear from others here, as well as the Department of Wildlife, because at this point in time, that's the only access we have, is to have them make sure in the congressional language that we want, and we have to have our state representatives to Congress pushing that for us, because if we don't, I don't think we're going to get it. But I know locally and on the national level, it's from a national defense and a national pride issue. This state has always been, as pointed out by Commissioner Young, the state that has taken a lot of things for this country in national defense. And this is just seen an expansion of that with the new weaponry and training, as well as the complexity of dealing with our enemy, which is no longer, a conventional ground force. But I really would highly recommend that we look as we go forward into a congressional staff, because everyone I've talked to who's in congressional staff has been in support of these expansions for patriotic as well as defense reasons for this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Further public comment in Carson City? Come on up, Fred.
For the record, Fred Volz, two thoughts occurred to me as I was hearing the presentation and the discussion by the Commission. The first is, it would be very helpful to know if there's a possibility that fake bombs could be used if the primary purpose of this is for target practice. The damage that's done not only to the terrain but to the wildlife of using bombs is not particularly great, and if there's a possibility of retrieving those fake bombs for reuse, so much the better. And the second thing is, I did not hear anything from the Air Force or the Wildlife Department about any sort of estimate or actual count of animals that have been killed by these activities. And it doesn't seem as though there's been any attempt to measure that, and that would seem to be very useful if we're trying to protect our wildlife, to know the extent of the problem presently. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Any further public comment in Carson City? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the Commission for discussion and action. Commissioner Young.
Regarding Mr. Volz's comment about the fake bombs, I think they call them inerts or nerds. When I did have that opportunity, most of the rockets fired that's what they were. They were not massive explosions. They were very small dispersals, and they're just pieces of metal and shooting at the ground with maybe some food coloring type dust in there, something. It's not a massive explosive, and the majority of them certainly are. I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe these gentlemen know, but I know there's some real ones, real explosives, but most of them are fake.
Commissioner Hubbs.
It seems like if we're going to put out a letter, which I would be behind or support to our legislature, the people who serve on our legislature, I think it would be important for us to understand from the department what resources are at issue, so we can correctly state and just, communicate what our concerns might be. Is there a way that we can ask for that information so we have it on hand?
I think Mr. Janae may be able to help us with that.
For the record, Habitat Division Chief Alan Janae. Mostly what you heard here today is kind of our initial, knowing that this is the scoping period. Definitely what you've heard is the species, the access, the restoration abilities on these lands. We could probably put together a very quick laundry list to supply to assist in drafting a letter, but understanding that much of this will be developed as the NEPA documents move forward. As you saw from the laundry list in the EIS, most of these will be analyzed, and we will be supplying the information to the agencies that are doing these. So, but we can very quickly, grab kind of the high points and give them to you if that would assist you.
Yes, I think that would help in the development of the letter that we would like to put out, for sure.
Commissioner Johnston.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. I understand the position from the fraternity and they're being opposed to further withdrawals. I think it's a little premature for the commission to just say today that we're opposed to any and all withdrawals under any circumstances. I get concerned that if you take that stance now, you may still have the seat at the table, but you may not be heard as much in the process that goes forward. I would make a motion that this commission develop a letter with the department's assistance, and that the letter be addressed to the Nevada congressional delegation, all the members of the delegation, as they'll stand come, I guess, January, and with the appropriate copies to the Department of Navy, United States Air Force, and Department of Defense, whoever the appropriate individuals are there. And that in that letter, we, first highlight that how the proposals, the areas involved, the wildlife at issue in those areas, as well as the habitat, and then specific items relating to NDOW being a cooperating agency in the process, and that key concerns from this commission, the overarching concern is obviously the impact of any withdrawals will have on Nevada wildlife, both game and non-game species, access by the public, not just for recreational activities, but access issues with respect to habitat development, maintenance, the work that the Department of Wildlife does, and then as well as impacts that the activities on the withdrawn areas might have on the wildlife itself. That's not a very articulate way to draft a letter off the top of my head. I have it in my mind as to what this letter would look like, but I can't really do it in the form of a motion, but that's my motion.
Second it. I have a motion by Vice Chairman Johnston and a second by Commissioner Barnes. Is there any further discussion from the commission? Commissioner Young.
I agree with the motion. However, I would suggest that we have Commissioner Johnston assist in the compilation of that letter, since he has it in his mind, and knowing what a sharp attorney and commissioner he is, I think he should be part of that effort with the director's permission.
Anything further from the commission? I think I agree with you. Does the motion maker agree to that?
That's fine.
And the second. Okay. Hearing no further discussion, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes 8-0 with Commissioner Drew in the audience.